Hey, I'm Jake Sherman, founder of Punchbowl News, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning to moderate a pop-up conversation with Arkansas Congressman Steve Womack. We'll talk about news of the day, the future of the defense and industrial pipeline, and afterward I'll be joined on stage for a fireside chat with Shyam Sankar, the Chief Technology Officer of Palantir Technologies. A big thank you to Palantir for partnering with us to make this conversation possible. As always, we encourage you to share about this event on social media. You could find us at Punchbowl News on all social media channels and at punchbowl.news online. Thank you very much for subscribing. I hope you all do. If you don't, I'll talk to you afterwards. And with that, I'd like to welcome Congressman Womack to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, are you prepared?
I have no notes.
That's even better. Just to level set, Congressman Womack is an appropriator. He has a lot of power on Capitol Hill. He probably won't like to admit that. He is the cardinal of transportation, housing, and urban development, which has a big chunk of the, relatively speaking, most of the a lot of federal spending. So let's start with this.
Earmarks.
Earmarks are a lot of
community
things.
Projects.
Yes,
Most.
which you don't get in the CR, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's start with this. Election was very good for the Republican Party. You have the House, you have the Senate, you have the presidency. You have the House by a margin of anywhere from 0 to 2, which will give you plenty of breathing room. Let's start with this. Does Donald Trump, how do you see the mandate that voters have given him and the Republican Party?
Well, we've unified government, but I have stopped a bit short of using the word mandate. Not that there wasn't a mandate for change, but the margins are so thin, 53 in the Senate, and pick the number in the House right now,
19 to
anywhere from 2 or 3 maybe to a net 0, that we still don't have a lot of margin for error, and prosecuting an agenda that is consistent with what the president-elect laid out in his campaign is automatically problematic because of the makeup of the House. And, midterms aren't going to be that far away, and people are already beginning to think about midterms. And so how do you execute your legislative agenda successfully and at the same time kind of run against history and protect your majority? And that's going to be a needle to thread for Speaker Johnson and his leadership team that's not going to be real easy. The difference, though, between this thin majority and what we have right now in the 118th Congress is that we have the White House and the influence of the White House to kind of bring some of our characters, if you will, into the fold. And he will need to exercise, he'll need to have that. But we're going to operate for a while with minus some people, minus some positions. We're already down Matt Gaetz in the 118th Congress, and we will be down Elise Stefanik, we'll be down Mike Waltz, and there will be special elections that will replenish those absences, but it will take some time. I'm pretty confident that the governor of New York is not anxious to really call a special election real fast.
She probably is not.
So these are the challenges that we're going to be facing. And who knows what's looming out there on the horizon from an economic perspective or a national security perspective. We got a huge request for disaster funding, and we got a lot of people hurting right now that Congress needs to be able to address. So and then debt ceiling, January 2nd. We're going to now extraordinary measures will allow us a little bit of time, but we're going to have to come up with a plan there. So we got a lot on our plate, and finishing FY25 appropriations is my number one goal right now, to try to get that across the finish line.
So as an appropriator, you are not a fan of CRs, continuing resolutions, by nature. No appropriator likes to fund the government on a 30, 60, 90-day basis. The speaker is talking about a CR sometime into March, perhaps earlier. We'll have to see where he comes down. Well, I'm going to ask you two questions. Talk for a second about just that play call, and also talk about you are a military man. A lot of your efforts on Capitol Hill been focused on national security, the military. The Pentagon hates this. They like to plan 20 years into the future, 10 years into the future, but certainly not 60 days into the future. That doesn't help them, correct?
That's absolutely true. CRs are bad, maybe a little worse than big omnis, but certainly better than a government shutdown. Full year appropriations, regular order, that's what we should be providing all of our agencies, not just national defense, but every agency deserves the ability to plan their program of work and do it in a fashion that on October 1st that they can hit the ground running and we not be into the month, at Thanksgiving or into January or February or March with, operating on a continuing resolution. It's particularly hurtful to the Pentagon because of this idea that you're not going to have any new starts. And technology, as evidenced by what this panel is about, and what you will hear about later, is changing rapidly. And the speed at which it is changing is not consistent with dealing with CRs and no new starts and no opportunity to really address the ongoing challenges that the modern battlefield has today. So those are the things that really trouble me, and I think the American people, they don't necessarily understand the complexities involved in a continuing resolution and the impact it has downrange on our warfighters.
And we always say it's no way to run a railroad, but it's no way to run an appropriators view and in people who think about this as view. It's no way to run the most powerful nation in the world on a 30 to 60 day basis. I think that's what the Pentagon's view is. Let's talk about the topic of the day, defense, industrial policy. If you were to get, let's zoom out for a second, 2025 appropriations, what is the Appropriations Committee and what is your priority on defense spending? I mean, that's a loaded question. You could probably go for 2 hours on that. But how do you view Pentagon spending and priorities right now?
Well, that's a very broad question.
I know. I'd like to keep it broad so you could take it wherever you want.
It's an extremely large expense. It's more than half of the discretionary budget of the U.S. government. So it's a big number. But I look at it more in terms of what is, generally speaking, what are we, as it relates to our economy? We're at round numbers, about 3% of GDP on defense, and which is very low, in my opinion, given the challenges that we face around the globe. And so from a 30,000 foot view, I am of the belief that we are not doing enough to push resources into national defense that is going to be required in order to be able to meet the constitutional imperative of provide for the common defense of this country. And with all the saber rattling going on, whether it's the South China Sea or in Eastern Europe or Iran or wherever, Middle East, we have a very complicated world security issue that we're dealing with right now. And then, as I said a minute ago, the speed at which a lot of technology is changing today's battlefield, and we're seeing it played out in Eastern Europe. And I had lunch this week with Randy George, Chief of Staff of the Army. The technology that we need, the emerging technology that we need out there, we just can't provide because we're caught up in the muck of a continuing resolution and can't do new starts. So, and then on another general scale, I think we need to change the complicated Pentagon acquisition related process. We incentivize the wrong things and disincentivize the right things. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not an expert on it, but I can tell you that our adversaries, the people that we are planning to deal with in a potentially kinetic way don't operate on CRs, and they are capable of using literally off-the-shelf basic stuff to be able to have relevance in this complicated world of ours. And we've got to get past that. And that's why I like innovation, and I like the ability for us to be able to engage the private sector, but we're going to have to incentivize them. Here's the bottom line to it, Jake. For all of these kind of startups, these people with great ideas and the ability to do the research and development and produce the product, they need to know firsthand that they have a customer in the United States Department of Defense, that we will, if it's the right stuff, and these private sector people are going to be pursuing the right stuff based on real-time need, they need to know that if they do that, then the United States of America is going to be a customer of theirs. They need that certainty, and that certainty will only come if we can have a resource mechanism that is predictable and reliable and meets the needs of today's battlefield.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I have a lot of questions based on that, but the role of public-private partnerships with the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, as it relates to national security and technology. I mean, these talk a little bit about these partnerships and why they're so important to the Pentagon and to the private sector.
Well, first of all, it's not pie in the sky; it's a requirement.
Yep.
Right now, we just do not have the capacity to do everything that we need to do internal to government to be able to develop the technologies that are going to be useful, whether it's in space or cyber or unmanned systems and whatever. We've got to have that public-private partnership, as I mentioned a minute ago, just to be able to, I think, stay ahead and have that advantage, both strategic and tactical advantage on all of these systems. We have to have that. It is an imperative right now. It's not anything that we would like to have. It's going to be a requirement going forward. So that's why I like what I'm seeing out there with a lot of our companies that are doing some pretty incredible work. And without going into names right now, we just have a lot of really good stuff happening in that private sector field.
Do you is there more Congress should be doing to foster these types of partnerships, besides not passing CRs, which would probably be helpful in and of itself?
Well, reliable funding would be a good start. I'm not a big fan necessarily of just throwing money at the problem. We do that with a lot of things, trying to change behavior and what have you in government. But I think the private sector, they got a responsibility to their shareholders and to their investors, and they've got to be able to prove that what they're doing is relevant. It just can't be motherhood and apple pie related. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be profitable to them, and we've got to be able to make sure. I think the back to what I said a minute ago, if we can let them know, if we can encourage them to do what they do in a partnership sort of way, that they're going to have a customer at the end of this process, then I think that's sufficient for them to be able to execute their technological abilities.
Let's talk about, you alluded to this, and this is in the news as well, but this DOGE effort, which is the Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk effort, which is trying to create not only savings in government, but it seems like it's just looking, generally speaking, to streamline all sorts of government efforts. We were talking a little bit about this before, but they've indicated, we're going to streamline processes and the tax code in the Pentagon. I mean, what is your thought on whether that could be successful and whether that's a good use of time?
I like the idea, much like I like the ability for government to right-size itself by having the ability to do it free of the political pressures that come with it. I'm reminded of what happened under previous base realignment and closure programs, the BRAC system. I have said publicly before that I think we need to BRAC government. It's not just defense, but there's a lot of things that we do at the federal level that waste taxpayer resources that could be either done away with or move to the private sector, just where the American taxpayer is not responsible for it. I'll give you an example. When I chaired FSGG,
that's financial services and
financial
government,
services, general
for
government.
Those of you who are not fluent in appropriationese.
So I had GSA, and I see Lauren Flynn back there, my former clerk. She loves this. We had GSA, and under COVID, people went home.
And GSA runs the buildings.
A lot of those people haven't returned. And in many cases, some of those people won't return for all the right reasons, that they can create efficiencies in a, quote, work off-site environment, at home, whatever. But we don't need to keep all of the buildings and all the other office space and maintain that office space. That's just waste. Now, are we nibbling around the edges? Yeah, if you just look at one piece of it, but there are many cases across the spectrum of federal spending that the appropriators deal with that when you start adding this stuff up, we're talking about some real numbers. Now, it will pale in comparison to the notion that DOGE is going to cut $2 trillion of federal spending. I mean, let's think about this. We're going to spend $6-ish trillion this year, 6.5, whatever the number is, and we're going to make $4.5 trillion. So we got a couple of $1 trillion in there that we got to find in savings. And the discretionary budget of the U.S. government is what? About $1.6 trillion? Now, this audience and the people that are watching this, I mean, they're pretty sharp in logic and decent in math.
I'm not good at math, and even I could do those numbers.
They can figure out real quickly, you're not going to solve this issue by having a massive food fight on discretionary spending.
Right.
Which is what we do and what we continue to do, as if that's the only federal spending out there. I have said before, at the risk of sounding like I'm interested in cutting programs, because that's not what I'm saying, but if you don't deal with the major drivers of the deficit and the debt, you're never going to get to that $2 trillion worth of savings. So that means you're going to have to look at the promises we made to the American people on the social safety net side to include the net interest on the debt. And we're going to have to figure out a way to make those sustainable without continuing to drive those costs higher, which is squeezing the discretionary budget even more. Here's a data point. You ought to do this. Go back, and I went back to the year that I ran for Congress the first time, 2010, and we we took the discretionary spending number, I think it was about $1.3 trillion at the time, and we applied the Fed's recommended growth rate, 2% of growth year over year, to that number, and then ran it out into the current scenario, 2024, 2025, and you would be surprised where that number would end up. It's higher than what we're writing discretionary budgets to today. It's higher because the issue is not discretionary spending.
Right.
So anybody would accept, really, 2% growth. It's the Fed's growth rate recommendation. Anybody would accept that, but the mandatory side has just gone completely out of sight, and in many cases, spending on medical care, read Medicare, Medicaid, has gone higher in many cases than the rate of inflation. So you're going to have to solve for that issue. Now, don't shoot the messenger. I mean, I'm just telling you the facts. And when I did
we weren't going to shoot you, so don't.
Well, when I did budget process reform back in 2018, at the request of Paul Ryan, I led that effort. And when I did the federal budget, the House version of the federal budget for 2019, I made one small change just to test our appetite to deal with that big problem, where I changed the age of Medicare eligibility from 65 to 67 to equalize it with Social Security. And you would have thought that I canceled a day of the week. My mail, my phone calls, and here's what I'm saying. We know where the problem is, and any member of Congress, if they're honest, they'll tell you what the problem is. We just don't have the solution, because people on the right don't want to talk about revenues. People on the left don't want to talk about restructure or cuts. I like to talk about growth first, because I think the elixir that's going to fix what's wrong with America is going to be a job for every eligible American. But anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but the fact is, it's not the discretionary budget that's hurting us so much.
Let's talk about, I want to get back to the Pentagon for a second, the procurement process, which has been something that Congress has been involved in talking about, and private sector has been involved in talking about reforms to that. That's one thing that DOGE is at least hinting that they're directionally going in that direction. It's pretty arduous, especially for new entrants into the sector, into federal contracting and into Pentagon contracting. What do you think Congress should do, can do, is doing to help streamline that? Or what could Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy do to fix that?
Well, I think there has always been this notion that you got to be a big player in order to be able to engage in this acquisition issue, and we have to change that. And again, I'm not a subject matter expert, but I just know this: the development of technology and the new weapons platforms, equipment, and the like just takes too long. There are too many places in the supply or in the development chain where this thing gets kind of held up. And in some cases, it gets held up sufficiently that the technology then becomes obsolete.
Dated, right.
And so we have to speed up the process by which we are able to develop this technology. That's why the public-private partnership with a lot of our smaller companies is going to be critically important. But a lot of these smaller companies don't have the staying power or the capital to be able to endure such a long process. So we got to make it simple for them so that they can do what they do, and they do it well, knowing that the customer is going to be there at the end, the United States government. So fixing that process is going to be a major component, I think, of what DOGE is going to do as it relates to defense spending. And you know, it's not that I think, I don't think we spend enough on defense, but we waste too much money in areas of the defense budget that could be applied to other areas that could make us a much more leaner and more capable fighting force, and be able to push a lot of that technology down to the warfighter, where the warfighter actually needs it.
Two rapid fire questions. One area where Republicans and even Democrats have been singing from the same song sheet is China, which is one of the geopolitical focuses of, at least stated focuses of this administration, Congress, and the world. The Trump administration appears to be putting a lot of China hawks into the administration, top to bottom. I mean, Marco Rubio being one of them, Michael Waltz, your, I guess, current colleague, and Elise Stefanik is another one. Are there things that Congress, that when it comes to tech, that the U.S. needs to bolster when it comes to safeguarding against adversarial countries like China?
Well, yeah, all of the above.
Yeah.
Everything. China is, that's the pacing threat. And I think anybody that pays attention to what's going on from a worldview must understand that the pacing threat is China. And we get distracted sometimes with some of the other skirmishes that are going on, not to minimize what's going on in Eastern Europe as just a skirmish. I mean, it's a full-scale war, or what's happening with Israel in the Middle East, and what other nefarious actors and violent extremists want to do. Those are all important, but long range, big picture. The things that China is doing on the scale, militarily, economically, is incredibly problematic for the country, particularly if, in fact, their timeline is a potential invasion of Taiwan in 2027, which everybody talks about. So I don't know what the future is going to hold, but we cannot take our eye off that ball. And I think we've done a pretty good job of pivoting out of that Middle Eastern scenario of warfighting that we did for 20 plus years, and now concentrating on what's happening in the Pacific.
Congressman Womack, thank you very much.
Honored to be with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jake. Appreciate it.
Now we're going to welcome to the stage Shyam Sankar, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Palantir Technologies, for a fireside chat. And this is a great data point that I found out last night or yesterday when I was reading is he's employee number 13 at Palantir, which I'm employee number 1 at Punchbowl News. But I mean, I think we're talking. I think we're talking about scales of magnitude here. So we're going to get to a lot of the stuff that Mr. Womack said, much of which was interesting and falls right within your wheelhouse. But talk through your role at the company and how Palantir is approaching working with the Pentagon and the new administration.
So as CTO, I oversee the product strategy across commercial and government. 50% of what we do is actually commercial. Every Chrysler car, every HD Hyundai ship, every Airbus airframe, we are bending atoms better with bits. And how do I leverage that to enhance national security? So we started as a company that really wanted to solve a handful of problems in counterterrorism for a handful of institutions.
Yep.
And you couldn't imagine a more different innovation scenario in government when we got started, right? Like the only place we could start was with In-Q-Tel and the intelligence community. There were no front doors to the Defense Department. Now there are side doors, open windows, the whole ecosystem has emerged. And that is, I think, what really excites me right now and why I put out my 18 theses of how to reform defense.
Well, that was my next question. You led me right there. Give us and this is, by the way, it's an interesting time because this is like, and we were talking a little bit about this backstage, but we are in a moment in time where where reforms to the government they're not only in vogue, but I mean, we might actually see some real movement on that. So tell us about your 18-point plan, point by point, in which detail. No, what are the top lines of it?
Yeah, I think to motivate it, like the beginning part of it, so we're very clearly in a state of undeclared emergency. We have this very hot Cold War that's happening. You have North Korean troops in Ukraine. Yeah. You have a pogrom in Israel itself. You have the tensions that are rising in the South China Sea. So almost counterfactually, what more would we have to say to think, okay, this is the moment we need to deter World War III? When I think about the industrial base that won World War II, that really won the Cold War, it couldn't look any more different than our current industrial base. And that's what gives me concern. I think this is the moment to fix that. So when the Berlin Wall fell, only 6% of major weapon system spending went to defense specialists, to the primes. Mm-hmm. The rest of it went to what I call dual purpose companies. Look, missiles are single use. The dual use is not the solution.
For now.
Everything. Well, for now. And maybe hopefully it stays that way. But we really had a American economy that was invested in both prosperity and freedom. Chrysler built cars and missiles. Ford built satellites until 1990. General Mills, the cereal company, built torpedoes. Right, so it's almost like that's not that long ago. That was 30 years ago, and we've really forgotten that. So today, that 6% has turned into 86%. We have taken the industrial base and put them on the Galapagos Islands. And when we look at our competitor in China, they have actually copied what we used to do. Only 27% of Chinese primes revenue comes from the PLA. The rest, unfortunately, comes from American consumers buying cheap crap on Amazon. We are subsidizing Chinese lethality against U.S. service members. And I think this is the moment to really re-explore that. There's a reason we had Chrysler building munitions. Maybe we should go back to a world where we have Tesla building munitions. It's not true that we can't make things in America. It's not evenly distributed. It's with the new American industrial base. And that's the call, that we now have a defense industrial base. We used to have an American industrial base. We should get back to that.
So that's an interesting point. And you have a front row view to this. I mean, you're interfacing with with the Pentagon a lot and a lot of these folks all the time. What do you think the Pentagon looks like if they implement some of these changes?
Well, I think there's a huge appetite within the Pentagon to do this. I think a lot of it is kind of hamstrung between the interactions between Congress and the building, following these processes. People love to besmirch David Packard's 5000 series. When he wrote that, which is a series of acquisition, procedures and regulations, it was a 7-page document. It is now more than 2,000 pages. So was it David Packard or was it the barnacles that we accumulated over the last 40 years here? We've forgotten the primacy of winning. When we had great power conflict, when we were in the Cold War, we really understood that, and the process was there to serve that. Now we've kind of started praying at the altar of the process, and we forget whether it's going to help us win or not. And as long as we follow the process, we're a victim to it.
Do you? Let's talk about China for a second, which is we touched on it with Congressman Womack. It is, as I said, it is one of the big areas in which Republicans and Democrats seem to be on the same page. The administration, this administration, the next administration. There's degrees of hawkishness, but there's a general recognition that China is a major geopolitical problem for the United States. What role do you think technology plays when it comes to deterring a emerging power or a power like China?
A substantial role. Like, ask yourself, how many new major weapon systems or platforms can we field between now and 2027? Well, whatever we can do, let's go and do as fast as. But I tell you what, we can field a lot of software between now and then. We can field a lot of AI between now and then. We ship 90,000 upgrades to our software a week, and combine that across the breadth of the American industrial base. That is where the incremental lethality really comes from. It's almost like there's nothing new under the sun. This is just John Boyd's OODA loop implemented in software, not in your brain. And they have weapons, we have weapons. Who employs them the best is really what the competition is about, and where you're going to derive deterrence from.
Do you, as a company, Palantir has made a commitment to working with Western allies. Talk about what that looks like, and I mean, it's obvious why that's very important, but talk a little bit about that.
Well, we believe in the West. It's very depressing to see that only 27% of American youth believe in American exceptionalism. And as someone whose family fled great violence in Nigeria to settle in the U.S., I was raised with the visceral understanding of the counterfactual. But for the grace of this nation, I'd be dead in a ditch. So I don't know. I think we can also look back at history and say that there are these periods of nihilism. Like, I was reading that George Lucas, he made American Graffiti because he was so tired of this sort of pessimism that had set into the American society. We're so bad. Look how we screwed up the world, kind of exiting Vietnam. And I really think that media narrative set the wave of the roaring 80s that we had here. And I think hopefully we're close to bottoming this out.
Talk about, okay, so we always say on Capitol Hill, and I think this is true at the Pentagon, and it's true in any government entity, people are policy, right? No matter where you are. I mean, even in companies, right? You get the right people,
Absolutely.
They're going to make the right decisions.
I might just to double click on that. I think we've forgotten that in a profound way. Like, we call it the F-16, but maybe we should call it John Boyd's plane. Admiral Rickover served for 30 years as the head of naval reactors. Kelly Johnson, you wouldn't have the U-2 or the SR-71 without him. So there's a great way in which I think the person is the program.
Yeah.
And a big part of one of the points in the theses here is we kind of have moved around with DOPMA and how we think about our joint force, and coming out of Goldwater Nichols, it's like you've ended up accreting a series of experiences. It's almost like you're filling out a bingo card, but you haven't had enough focus and attention to compound on what you've learned, both what goes wrong and what goes right. I've been at Palantir 19 years. I've learned more from the things I've screwed up, which are enormous, than I have from the things that have gone well. And I think that is the asset that I continue to compound going forward. We need that in our weapon systems, in the direction that we're taking for the technology that we have.
Where does that, and I'm going to zoom in on this for a second, but where does that kind of fall apart? I mean, how much resistance? I mean, any institution, any big institution like the Pentagon, Congress, any large-scale institution has scar tissue and resistance to change. I mean, how hard is it to break that and to get things moving?
Well, I think this is maybe one of the fundamental issues, which is everyone's looking for an enduring solution to fix acquisition, or an enduring solution to fix the system. What if there are no enduring solutions? What
Just
if
case by case?
Yeah, there are problems that can be solved,
Right.
and there are problems that can be managed, and you need great leadership to manage this problem every single day. So I think you got to get the right people on the problem. That it starts there. The second part with defense acquisition is just understanding that the problem is structural. You have to manage it because the department is a monopsony. And I think the monopsony, everyone knows monopoly, where there's one seller. Monopsony is when there's one buyer of a thing. Imagine if you, as the sole buyer, had to conceive of the iPhone and write the requirements and then tell Apple. It's not, it's like at some fundamental level, you either believe in the free market or you don't. And, I like to quip that the Chinese and the Russians, everyone has given up on communism except for Cuba and the DOD. We have 5-year centralized plans.
I'm going to use that, actually. That's a good one.
And I mean, general officers chuckle at that very heartily because they're like caught in the system. They're forced to conform to this very centralized, centrally unplanned, you might say, process.
Yeah.
And we're not better commies than the commies.
That's a really good line. AI is something that Congress, amazingly, is just beginning to wrap its head around in the commercial space, and in the defense sector and the government space. But talk about AI and its role in defense, and its role and now and in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in the future.
I think to cheapen AI for a second, because there's so much hype about it, I think a useful mental model is AI is software that works.
Yep.
At some very
advanced software that works.
Yeah. So if you start thinking about that, maybe like by reducing the exoticism, we can see the utility. And the utility is it's going to allow you to make decisions faster. It is the OODA loop. It is how do I get decision advantage on my adversary? How do I see further around the corners than they can see? How do I put effects on them? And as a consequence, create the deterrence that's necessary so that they don't want, today is not the day. And so I think very obviously where the energy is gone is employing this stuff to things that are time sensitive. How do I speed up the kill chain by doing this? But we've also had great success at doing it in what you might traditionally consider back office functions in government, like machine assisted disclosure. So if you're taking the foreign disclosure process, how do I share intelligence with allies where I need to take the intelligence we have, rewrite it in a way that's releasable? Well, you have this security classification guide that tells you how to rewrite these things. You have the raw intelligence. Historically, you've had humans bleeding from their eyeballs trying to read the guide, rewrite these things. It takes days to get the intel out. It's almost irrelevant by the time you get it out to your allies. Well, the AI can do that in minutes. And that has a clear consequence. So people aren't doing it because they want cost savings; they want decision advantage. But I think it's very broadly. We have more civilians in the Department of Defense than we do have uniformed service members. We have more contracting officers than there are Marines. So there's clearly an opportunity here to use this to make us go faster, and as a consequence, be able to reallocate resource to the tooth and away from the tail.
So we're going to wrap in a second. I have to ask you one question before we wrap up, which is there's a lot of people watching who are involved in Congress and involved in government, and people who are watching the live stream who are involved in Pentagon and Congress as well. Give your elevator pitch about what you want people to take away from this conversation. Which has been fascinating, by the way.
I think one of the things, particularly when it comes to Congress, we need to put more emphasis on the cash chain, not the kill chain. You know, our ability to move money around to resources. If technology is making everything go faster in the world, you can't have a 2-year POM process. You can't have a 5-year FIDIP. Or you can have those things, but you have to understand, according to military doctrine, that plans are useless, even if planning is invaluable. So let's agree that budgeting is invaluable, but the only thing you can know about any given budget is that it's wrong. So how do we create the necessary continuous integration of this so that we can move money around to the things that really matter? I think there are great ideas around this, going to capability elements instead of program elements, giving more discretion to the uniformed service members. I'm tired of this shibboleth of, we deserve all this oversight because we've shown we're not good at spending the American taxpayers' money. That's not how innovation works. Innovation is chaotic and messy. And if you try to institute processes that make sure that nothing goes wrong, the consequence, you can't lop off one end of the distribution without lopping off the other. It will ensure that nothing goes right. So we're locked into a system where we just are guaranteed mediocrity.
We have to leave it there. Sham, thank you so much for your time. We are out of time. A big thank you to Congressman Womack and his team for making this morning possible, and for Palantir for partnering with us to make this conversation possible. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, man. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.